That is
And but it's still study online.
when you go up, down.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Oh
But
yes.
we can go to church.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's good.
Some of those
Have that contact with other people.
Yeah.
Important. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Righty. Let's make a start. Sorry about that. You may have noticed we're changing the hall at the moment. So you can see the hole in the wall.
Oh, yeah.
And you can see the scaffolding, and back there underneath those speakers you can see a new camera that's going in, so we can do zooming sessions. So, and then there's this, so that's all new, so it's all changing at the moment. But before we start, let's begin by offering a prayer to the God. Dear God, it's good to be inside where it's warm and dry on a cold night, and to spend time reading the Bible and understanding more about you. We are grateful for the time that we have now to read the Bible and to understand it, and we pray for your help to learn things that will bring us close to you. So help us, God, and we offer this prayer in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. All right, so when we left off last class, we were talking about the departure of Israel from Egypt. That's right. So this is the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but many generations further on. Moses was a great-grandson of Jacob. So Jacob's son, Jacob's daughter was called, I'm going to go with Jochebed. Correct me if I've got that wrong.
Sorry.
So let's go the other way. Moses' parents were called Amram and Jochebed. One of those, I can't remember whether it was Amram or Jochebed, was the daughter of Levi, Levi was the son of Jacob, the third son of Jacob. Too much memory going on there. Okay, so the third son of Jacob, Levi, had a daughter, let's go with Jochebed, who was the mother of Moses. So that's 3 generations on. But for many families, it would have been many, many more generations. It would have been 5 or 6 generations, perhaps even 7 for some families. It appears that Levi had children late, and Jochebed had a son quite late as well. And Moses was not actually the oldest son of Amram and Jochebed. He was in fact the youngest. So there were 2 other children, Miriam and Aaron. I think Miriam was the oldest, Aaron was the next, but you need to check me on that one. And Moses was in fact the youngest of their children. And so Moses is now going to lead the entire nation. It is now a nation. There are now tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of descendants of Jacob. So let's just step back a little bit. Abraham left Ur, which is in modern day Iraq-ish. He traveled across Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq and Syria, and down to modern day Israel/Jordan. And that's where Abraham lived. Abraham had, he had several sons, a number of sons. I think he had about 8 sons, but the one we are interested in was called Isaac. Isaac had 2 sons, just 2, Esau and Jacob. The one we are interested in is called Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons and at least 1 daughter. And when Jacob and his family went down to Egypt to escape that terrible famine in the time of Joseph, there were 70 members of his family. they're specifically counted, 70. And now there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of descendants of Jacob, a number of generations on. And they leave Egypt, as we remember, chased by Pharaoh after the 10 plagues, across the Red Sea. The sea opened up and they walked somehow on dry land in the middle of the sea. And then as they crossed that sea, slam shut on top of Pharaoh and his army. And now they're on the other side of the sea. And so what we want to do is we want to track their journey. So let's open up our map at the back of the Bible. Map 2 or 7, I think it is. Let me check. No, pardon me. Go with map
14.
14 or 2. Yes. 14 or 2, whichever one you like. So they were in.
Yes. Oh, you want to read English or Chinese?
Oh, it's okay.
Chinese.
English is okay. Yeah.
Cool. So they were in this area here, Goshen. That's where the Jewish people lived when they were in Egypt. Okay. So here, this is where they were, up in Goshen. That section there. So they were up here in Goshen. And then as they fled south. Now we don't know how far south they went, but somewhere they crossed the Red Sea, which is this tongue of water here. So this tongue of water here. Now we don't know where they crossed it, whether it was far up or low down. There is lots of arguments about this. Let's not get worried about where they crossed it, but they did cross somehow. And where they came out would have been a desert, a wilderness in Bible language. And they are going to be led through some very difficult circumstances now into what's called the Promised Land. Now, the Promised Land was the land that Abraham had been promised. Remember, God said, look, north and south and east and west, all the land you see, I will give it to you and to your offspring. Great, you've got the word, forever. And so they were going to inherit the land. It was a land promised to Abraham and his offspring. Well, now here are the offspring of Abraham, and they're going to go to this promised land, but it's going to take them some time. And they're going to be led by, well, primarily by God. Now, we already saw God maybe not leading them, but certainly herding them in our last session. Because remember, there was a representation of God traveling with them. Do you remember that cloud, that cloudy fire? It would have looked like a tornado of cloud during the day and a tornado of fire during the night. And it traveled with them. Now, to start with, it was behind them, but for the rest of the journey, it will be in front of them, leading them. So it will go in a particular path. It won't go over the tops of mountains that they can't climb over. It'll go through a path that they can follow. And remember, this is not just able-bodied men. This is men, women, old, very young, animals, cattle and sheep. So it's a very sensitive community. They can't climb over mountains. They can't go into deep crevasses. The path has to be one that can be traveled by women with babies, by shepherds leading cattle. And so God leads them, and they would have seen this pillar, this tower of cloud, lead them in very, very interesting paths that are good for them to walk in. But they were also led by Moses. Now, because there were tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people had a lot of problems and a lot of things that needed to be sorted out. Moses couldn't do it on his own. And eventually he set up a system whereby there were, if you like, people who reported to him, and they guided the rest of the nation. So there were 70 elders who worked with Moses to guide the nation. They started setting up these systems and these ways of organizing themselves about, would have been about 11 or 12 days into their journey. They reached a place called Sinai. Now, again, there's lots of debate around where Sinai is. The traditional view, by which I mean the Catholic view, is that Sinai is, and we can see it on your map, it's down right there. See, it says Mount Horeb. That's the traditional view that the Catholics present. Now, one of the reasons they like that view is they happen to have a monastery there. And so lots of people want to visit that monastery and pay money to go up the mountain and all sorts of things. So it's good for them. This may be true. It may be false. Oh, yes, sorry, monastery, yeah. So a monastery is a, it's a community of priests, all males, usually. If you had a community of the Catholics' version of female priests, it's not quite the same thing, but nonetheless, that would be called a nunnery. So nuns are the females, and what do they call the monks? Monks are the males. So monks in a monastery. Okay, so that's the normal view of where Sinai is. I don't have a strong opinion of another location, but what the Bible tells us happened is when they reached this mountain, Moses climbed that mountain and talked to God. And God spoke to him at the top of the mountain and told him things to do. Not least, setting up these 70 elders. That wasn't Moses's idea. That was God's idea. God also set up some other things. He established a constitution. Yes. Yes, exactly. So this is really interesting. Like for a nation like China to establish a constitution, well, it's a big community. There's lots of people thinking very hard about it. There's revolutionaries who decide they need to do this to establish a firm foundation. What's happening here is completely different. This is a community of relatively uneducated slaves who have just escaped slavery 11 days earlier. And suddenly they've got a constitution. Now, their constitution was not written by them. It was received by Moses when he climbed up this mountain. He actually came back down the mountain on one occasion, in fact, on two occasions, holding these very well inscribed, what are called tables of stone. Now, they were probably shingles or slabs of rock, light enough. Yeah, so
Inscribed.
yeah, okay. So inscribed means to scrape. So if you want to write on rock, the way you write on rock is to scrape on the rock. So a tombstone is usually inscribed. So they'll scrape the name of the person into the tombstone. This was similar. Now, obviously, the rocks were thin enough that Moses could carry them down the mountain. If they were, the size of an average tombstone, well, Moses wasn't going to carry them anywhere. But these rocks, it says, were inscribed with the finger of God. It appears that Moses saw a hand writing on these rocks, and they had the foundation ideas on which the nation would be built. And there were rules that described worship, but also community. So they cover things like, I'm your only God. You must not worship any other gods but me. That was one of the things, but also covered, don't steal. You must not steal. You must not murder, and things like that. It was called the 10 Commandments. And then around those 10 Commandments, God provided a whole set of rules and constitutional devices that would allow the nation to function. And if you're interested in those, you can go through them, because the book of Leviticus largely covers these. So as you go through the book of Leviticus, you're going to find descriptions of the feasts, the sacrifices, the laws. Certain people had certain rules on them. So, for example, if you were sick, there were certain things you had to do, depending on the sickness. It's described in that book. Numbers has some of these as well. So they received rules and regulations, and also how to handle different criminal offenses. So, for example, there's a big section on what to do in the event of a murder. And there's a section on how to work out whether it was a murder or a manslaughter. Was it accidental or was it deliberate? And what is the difference in the way the nation's law system will handle these two crimes? And it goes through how they would deal with it. And bear in mind, this is in a time where people took the law into their own hands. So in these days, if someone killed a member of my family, well, then probably I'm going to start a blood feud with them, and I'm going to try and kill a member of their family. This is what the times were like, but God's law established a structure around that ensured that there were some protections if the killer killed the person accidentally. So all sorts of things. They were also given a whole list of details around building a place of worship. So it covered the exact dimensions, materials, and structure of their place of worship. Now, whoops, what's happened here, Simon? I think we've lost it. Is it my end or yours? We're back again. Cool. All right, so that is a scale model of their place of worship. It was in the English Bible, it's called the Tabernacle, and we're gone again. Yeah, I'm sure we'll be back in time. Exciting stuff. So in the English Bible, it's called the Tabernacle, but that's just the word that means tent. And it literally was just a tent, but a very particular sort of tent. It had multiple layers to keep it cool on the inside. It was actually structured using wooden boards all the way around. We won't worry about it anymore. And it had particular rooms within it in which there were to be particular things placed. So all of that was described to Moses by God up the mountain. Also, all the way they were going to worship and how they would worship and when they would worship. And there was a whole system built around worship. And in fact, what's really important for us to understand is that this place of worship and the system of worship that God established wasn't kind of isolated and different to everything else. It actually fit a model that was first established back in the Garden of Eden, and then would be repeated again in the temple that Solomon built, and then again in the temple that Ezra built, and then again in the temple that Herod renovated, and then again in a temple that is still to be built. There's this repetition of ideas that comes out of both the worship and the structure, because you see, God hasn't changed. The God who was way back there in the time of Adam and Eve is still the God today. And what he wants from people hasn't changed. And so he describes it in similar ways. But this is a tent. Now, when do you use a tent? What's a tent for as distinct to, say, a brick building?
Some special situation.
Yep.
Like go to wild area.
Absolutely, exactly. So if you go to if you're traveling and you want to be able to pack it up and carry it with you, you try carrying a brick building with you. You don't get very far, right? So this was specially constructed to be easy to take down, move, and reassemble. And in fact, God went to the level of explaining exactly how it was to be taken down and who was to carry which parts of it. There was a tribe that was specifically selected whose job was to set up and pull down that particular structure. It goes even further. It tells them how they were to carry it. So some of the pieces were to be carried on carts. Other of the pieces must be carried by hand. And so it's very, very detailed and explicit. And so when you think about what's going on here, think about, I guess, the experience that China went through in the 40s through to 60s with, as you know, coming out from underneath the colonial rule and becoming a nation again after that colonial period. Similar things happened. You know, there was a leader, there was a constitution, there was a system of community understanding, which, you know, in China is secularism, but in other communities it might be Islam or Christianity or Hinduism. There was a system of worship. They've got all of these things. They've got the leader, they've got a constitution, they've got a system of worship. They don't have that territory because that's where they're going. They're going to, as we said, the promised land. So the promised land is there colored in Israel, in yellow, and that's where they're going to go to. So the book of Exodus describes their journey there. And we're not going to go through it tonight because, well, there's heaps of stuff that happened, but we're just going to gloss over it. So what I want you to understand about this period of time as God led them to the promised land, two things. They could have got there very, very quickly. It's estimated they could have got there in as little as 3 weeks if they'd walked quickly and precisely through the desert and up to the promised land. Like that whole community, you know, a single person could do it in, you know, less than a week, probably. But this community, 3 weeks. It took them, or do any of you know how long it took them to do this journey? 12 days to the mountain, but from the mountain to the land took another almost 40 years. And during that 40 years, every single, well, I'll try and be a bit more precise. Almost every person who left Egypt and crossed the Red Sea died. In fact, there were only 2 named survivors. There are only 2 people who crossed the Red Sea and entered the desert who came out on the other side. Now, there may have been others, but there's only 2 named. And they're specifically described for us because it's important to know these 2 people. Their names are Caleb and Joshua. Caleb was a warrior, and God actually said to him, I will ensure you escape this desert because of your great faith in me. There was a situation in which they faced some difficulties in the middle of that desert, and every member of that nation said, we are going to die. God must hate us. In fact, we think God brought us here specifically so he could kill us. Every member of the nation said that. They all decided that despite the fact that God had sent 10 plagues on the Egyptians, walked them through the Red Sea, and was leading them with a pillar of cloud, that wasn't enough proof that God was on their side. And they decided that God hated them. If you think about it, that's so silly. If God wanted to, he could have killed them in the Red Sea. He could have killed them with the plagues. Or he could have just let them starve to death in the desert. He did none of those things. So there was one exception, two exceptions, but one exception we want to talk about now, and that was Caleb. He said, no, that's not true. Didn't you see those plagues? Didn't you see the Red Sea? God is with us. And God said, because of that wonderful belief in me, you alone will escape this desert, together with Joshua, who was the other man who showed faith on that occasion. Joshua, well, who was Joshua? Well, Joshua was a warrior too, but he was the understudy. You know what I mean by an understudy? Okay, so an understudy is somebody who is practicing to take over the role of another person. So, for example, if we are doing something in the theatre, a play, a drama, and you have a main actor, what will happen if that actor is sick on the night? You have a backup, exactly. And the backup practices the same role. They learn the same lines. They are the understudy. So Joshua was the understudy to Moses. And Moses did not leave the desert. He died there in that desert. Joshua will leave. So let's come across to Numbers chapter 11 and meet Joshua. So Joshua is, let me see, you need page 353. 355. 355. And I've sent you to the wrong passage. I apologize. Numbers 11.
Back around 225.
Thanks for that, Don.
Okay. Yeah.
At this point, Dan, can I say that the ladies have asked if we can all read around, the reason being that they would like to hear
Of course.
reading the English so that
That makes perfect sense. So that's fine. So Don, I'll get you to start.
It's numbers, not Joshua.
Yes, sorry, that was my fault, Susan. I led you all astray. So Don, when we're ready, could you read Numbers 11, verse 28, which is where we first meet Joshua?
Yeah, next page. Okay. Yeah.
Don, I'm going to get Don to read it.
Verse 28. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the assistant of Moses from his youth, said, my Lord Moses, stop them.
So, all we want to say from that is that Joshua is the assistant to Moses. That's what we just said. Joshua does have a very interesting name. And we've said this before, that Jesus he's the center of the Bible. He comes up again and again and again. We last saw him when we talked about the lamb and the blood splashed on the doors to save them from the angel of death. And we said, well, that represented Jesus Christ and his death. Well, here's another different symbol of Jesus Christ, because the name Joshua, it's a Hebrew name. If we translate it into Greek, which is the language of the New Testament, Hebrew is the language of the Old Testament. So Joshua in the Old Testament becomes Jesus in the New Testament. And what we're going to see is that Jesus will lead people out of a terrible wilderness into God's promised land. Joshua, pardon me. What did I say? Well, that's where we're going. So very good. Thanks. So Jesus is doing exactly the same thing today. He's trying to save us from the wilderness of our lives and take us to a land, a life he has promised. So there's a sort of relationship here. Both Joshua and Jesus, their names speak of the work of God in the lives of people. We won't go into it too deep, but this is a very, very pronounced connection. Joshua is called Joshua, the son of Nun. Now, Nun, N-U-N, is a Hebrew word. And normally, when you look at the names of people in this period of time, you can trace their family trees. Nun is a person who has no family tree. You cannot find out who Joshua's grandfather is. Never occurs. But Nun means something very important because it only ever occurs in one other place. So Joshua is called the son of Nun, and there is only one other place, one other way that that word is used, and it's used to describe eternity or forever. And just think about what that means. Jesus, the son of forever. Joshua, the son of Nun. Jesus, the son of eternity. Well, God is the God of eternity. And so there's a very powerful connection being drawn here between what Joshua will do in leading people into the promised land and what Jesus will do, the Son of God, the Son of eternity, in leading us to a much better life. All right, so let's come across now to meet Joshua's first important work in Numbers 13. And we'll read the story there. So Numbers 13, we're going to start at verse 1, actually. So Wendy, I'll get you to start, and can you read verse 1 and 2 for us, please, Wendy?
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Set men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall set a man, everyone a chief among them."
Okay, excellent and well read. Thank you for that, Wendy. So God here has said, we're going to go to this promised land, this land of Canaan, as it's called, the promised land. But I know you're scared. So what we'll do is we'll send some spies to see whether the land is good or bad. So they're going to pick spies, and they're going to pick spies from among the most influential men in the nation. So these spies, their job is to be, if you like, secret surveyors, and go through the land and look at whether it's good land or bad land, whether you can grow grapes or zucchini, what can you grow, and they'll work out what this land is like. And if you could read for us, Wendy, verse 4, because that introduces us, is it verse 4 I want? It's verse, I don't want verse 4, I just want verse, cannot see him. Where is he? Joshua. I don't want to read all of them because...
Hoshea, the son of Nun, in verse 8.
Verse 8. So if you could read verse 8 for us.
Is that Susan?
Susan, sorry.
Verse 8.
Yep.
From the tribe of Ephraim, Hosea, the son of Nun.
So that is our Joshua. Now, his name is spelt differently. Hoshea is Joshua. And this is him being selected to be one of those spies to go into the promised land and to check it out. So, verse 16, Rosemary, could you read verse 16 for me?
These were the names of the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land. And Moses called Joshua, the son of Nun, Joshua. Sorry, I read very well.
So here is Joshua being introduced to us. His name's Hoshea. Hoshea and Joshua are very similar in the Hebrew, and here it appears that Moses preferred to call him Joshua than Hoshea. But you'll find elsewhere there are other people in the Bible who have the same name, and it seems like it was spelt very similarly. So they are going to go up and they're going to spy out this land. So at this point in time, they are at this place called Kadesh Barnea. Let's see if I can just pinpoint Kadesh Barnea. So Kadesh Barnea is up here. That's right. So there we go. Whoa, that's difficult to drive. There you go. So they're at Kadesh Barnea. So that's this little dot here. And they've walked all the way through the wilderness, across the Red Sea. Somehow we don't know where they crossed the Red Sea, presumably down into the desert, and then back up to this place called Kadesh Barnea. It's taken them about 12 months. So 12 months into what we know will be 40 years. And from there, what they do is they send these spies. So that's the purple lines you can see there. These 12 spies are sent up into the land of Israel to check it out. And disappointingly, this was the occasion where everybody said, God hates us, he wants us to die, because the spies came back and they said, oh, it's a great land. It's fertile, it's green, you get the wonderful grapes growing there, everything's fantastic. But, one big but, the cities we cannot capture them. And what's more, living in all of those cities are giants, enormous men who we cannot beat in battle. Now, both those things were true. The cities were very hard to defeat, and there were some very big people in that land, bigger than them. But they'd of course forgotten that God had defeated the might of the army of Pharaoh. He told the sea to move, get out of the way. He could help them win this victory. And so their lack of faith meant that they wandered now in the wilderness. You can see that circle 3, the green circle. That's them wandering in this desert for another 38 years until they're all dead. So let's come to the other end of that journey, Deuteronomy chapter 31. Numbers, Deuteronomy 31, verse 14. So we're looking for page 327, and that will be your turn, Claire. So verse 14, Claire. So this is 40 years after they walked into the wilderness, and Claire reads.
And the Lord said to Moses, behold, the days approach when you must die for Joshua, and present yourself with the king of Egypt, that I may commission him. And Moses and Joshua present themselves with Egypt. Very good. Very fluent. Thank you for that, Claire. So God says, Moses, time up. You're going to die soon. Now that sounds harsh, but Moses is about 120 years old at this point. So he's a very, very old man. I don't think he would have been too sad. I think he was probably ready. Nonetheless, he says he's called by God, and the important thing is Joshua is going to be commissioned. So verse 23, Fran, across the page.
No.
And the Lord commissioned Joshua, the son of Nun, and said, "Be strong and courageous, for you shall bring the people of Israel into the land that I swore to give them. I will be with you."
So now God says to Joshua, all right, it's up to you. You take over from Moses. You will be the one who leads them out of this wilderness into the land. Now, just for a moment, imagine if you'd lived in a desert for 40 years, you might have forgotten there was anywhere outside the desert. Just one thing that occurs to me, you may be wondering about, and that is, what did they eat and drink while they were in this desert? Well, it appears from the record that God fed them, and what he did is he arranged for what they described as the bread of heaven to fall each during the night. Now, we don't quite know what it was, but it appears to have been some sort of seed-like object that fell on the ground, but it melted, so we're not quite sure what it was. They called it manna, which means, it's a very rude thing to call it. They called it manna, which means, what's this? It's literally what it means. What's this? But they collected it up, and it would keep for one day, and they ate that as a, if you like, bread replacement. Seems like it was very nutritious, and it could be ground and cooked into bread, and they could do all sorts of things with it. Also, God provided them with meat on various occasions. Flocks of birds flew in and just happened to land around their camp. And finally, with water. On numerous occasions, God either ensured that, for instance, there was occasions where they found springs that had been poisoned, and God made sure that the poison in those springs was removed. Or they came to a place where there was no water, and God arranged that a spring of water would suddenly come out of a rock that they could drink. And it appears also that for a lot of their journey, they traveled downhill, and one of the early springs of water that God formed flowed behind them. So they always had water with them, but that's not an important detail. But now, here they are. Moses is dead. 40 years have passed. Everybody who walked into the wilderness, apart from Joshua and Caleb, are now dead. It's a new generation. The children of those who walked into the wilderness are going to walk out. And they're going to be led by Joshua, who is going to lead them. Well, now they're up beside the land of Israel. So if we go back to our maps, let's just try and make sure we can put this in some sort of perspective. Show you where they've come to. So they've actually, they wanted to cross here, down here, round and round and round and round, and now they're up here. So they'll come up here. Yep, back one. No, not at all. Hard pages. Okay. So they came from there, they went down across the sea, down up here. And now up here somewhere.
The Dead Sea.
Dead Sea.
Yes. So they entered just to the north of the Dead Sea.
Okay, this
place near Jericho.
Oh yeah.
Almost on the
And what they're going to do is they're going to cross the River Jordan, which was a natural barrier. So here's the River Jordan. That's the River Jordan there. And they're going to cross it. That's a natural barrier into this promised land that God had said he would give them. So they're going to go into the promised land. So here's the promised land through here, and they're going to go up here. And Moses is going to lead them. And it's going to be difficult because there were great big walled cities and there were giants in many of those cities. So the first city they encountered was a city called Jericho. Jericho was just across the river. It's the first city they met. It's a wonderful story if you have time to read it. It's in Joshua chapter 6. It's very, very exciting. But what it was a confidence building exercise by their God. Because what they encountered was a city with strong, powerful walls, a city that knew they were coming and had closed its gates, a city that they thought they couldn't defeat. And God told Joshua how to defeat it, and it was the most strange thing. God said, you are to walk around the city. Okay, so everybody in the nation walked around the city. Joshua said, was that it? And he said, no, do it again tomorrow. So they did it the next day, and they kept walking around the city for 7 days. And then on the seventh day, they walked round and round and round the city 7 times. And on the seventh time, the priests, the Levites, the special tribe, the family of Moses actually, blew special trumpets they had made. When they blew those trumpets, all the people shouted, and we don't know how it happened, but down came the walls. Crumbled, crashing down. Maybe there was an earthquake. Maybe underground springs were undermining the walls. Who knows? But down came the walls, and that city was captured without a loss of life, apart from one man. Amazing. It would really built their confidence that God was with them. And so they defeated that city. The next city was harder, but eventually, with prayer and with effort, they defeated that city, and then into the land they went. And what they found was that this was a land occupied by many little kingdoms. There were kings everywhere. There was a king in this city and a king in that city and a king in that village, and they had to fight them one by one by one. And these kings were called the kings of the Amorites. And in fact, Joshua chapter 10 describes a battle, a series of battles with the Amorite kings. Now, Amorite just means they live in the mountains. That's what it means. The kings who lived, because everybody who built a city in those times would build it in a defensible place on the top of a mountain. And so Joshua fought battle after battle. And in many of them, God demonstrated that he was looking after them. And over time, they began to win and drive out the locals out of this land that God had promised them, until finally, well, the land was theirs to a degree. They hadn't actually managed to remove everybody who was a local, but mostly. And then God told Moses to divide up the land, and God described exactly which territory, which tribe of Jacob would get. And so every tribe got a section, except for one. The family of Moses, Levi, isn't up there. The Levites didn't get a section. What they got cities in every single tribe. It's about 48 of them scattered around the land. And so now they've become a nation. Got their leader, Joshua. They've got their constitution. It's here. We can read it. They have a place of worship, the Tabernacle. It travels with them. They now have territory. And as we said, this story of escaping a land of slavery and escaping a wilderness and arriving into the promised land through lots of effort, led by an amazing leader, well, it's really the story of our lives. It's the story of what Jesus is doing. Well, it's what he did then and what he's doing now. He was a teacher, he was a shepherd. In the future, he will lead his people into the promised land. And I'm just thinking it'd be great to look at that passage as our final passage. Hebrews chapter, the rest, that one. He would lead them into their rest. Let me just find a passage for you. I'll have to look it up. Just final passage I want to show you, but I've got to look it up. Just give me a second.
Page 393 or thereabouts. When Dan finds what he's looking for.
Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 8. So let's go to Hebrews 4.
Page 379. 379.
All right, we're going to read a few verses here. So Hebrews 4, 379 in the New Testament. We'll start with Ben, and we're actually going to start with verse 16 of the previous chapter. So chapter 3, verse 16. So 3 verse 16, and we'll read around the group.
Until
One verse each. Until verse 3 of chapter 4.
For who were these who heard and yet rebelled? Oh, was it not all those who left Egypt led by Moses?
And with, sorry.
No,
Yep.
You go.
And with whom was he, that is God, provoked for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness?
And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient?
So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief.
Therefore, where the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it.
For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listened.
For we who have lived enter that rest, as he had said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. So his works were finished from the foundation of the world.
So the Apostle Paul here asks a question, and his question is, who was God upset with? Well, it was with the children of Israel who left Egypt. They didn't believe in him, and they didn't trust him, and because of that, they could not enter the promised land. That's what he says in chapter 3, verse 16 to 19. Then in chapter 4, what he says is, because of that, there's still a promise available that people can enter the promised land, what he calls here the rest. In other words, the resting place, the land of relaxation and comfort. He says, we have to be careful. We don't want to miss out on that rest. He's talking to us as well. We don't want to miss out on that rest. That wonderful news of being able to enter God's promised land is to us just the same as it was to them. Now, they didn't listen to this message, says Paul. They did not believe in God. But we can
even today enter that rest, he says. Then I want us to go down to verse 8. So verse 8 through to verse 9. Verse 11, pardon me. Verse 8 to verse 11. Who's next?
For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have sworn by himself.
You have. That's the page.
I'm sorry, I'll start again.
It made sense for a minute there.
Yeah, the pages stick together. Okay, verse 8. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on.
So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God.
For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his.
Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience.
So what the apostle is saying here to us is that this rest is available. We can enter God's promised land. He's making a very strong argument that the promise given to the children of Israel of entering the land of Abraham and of being the offspring that got that land is still open. He's saying it didn't finish. We can still be part of that offspring, he's saying. And because of that, that promise is still available. He's saying that Joshua, even though he led them into the promised land, he didn't finish the job. He wasn't able to. And so it's our job now to strive to find our way to enter the promised land. And really, it's a modern hope. Because the promised land spoken of, the children of Israel back then thought that as soon as they got into the land, well, that was it. It was done. They're finished. But you see, there were still things that had to be done. The land that Abraham was promised, well, it would have no wicked people in it. Not mostly got rid of the locals, completely got rid of the locals. And the people who were moved in by God would not be sort of believers like they were. They would completely love God. And that has a particular name in the Bible. When the land of Abraham is filled with people who completely love God and is led not by Joshua, but by Jesus, that's called the kingdom of God. And that is the rest being spoken of there. So it's very relevant to us today. This story is powerful for us. It's about the battle to find our way into God's family and into God's promises. All right. Any questions? And if not, we'll wrap up.
Susan's got some questions. I said that she's been writing some notes. So it might be better to wrap up.
Oh, let's
before
wrap up
she
then.
can start.
Yes. All right. We'll say a prayer and then we can.
Oh, I just copied the answer on the.
Well done. All right. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for telling us about your land and about your people, about your promise, and about the restful lives that will be there for those who love you. Please bring that day soon when your kingdom is in Abraham's land. And please help us to be part of your family then when Jesus leads his family into God's land. We thank you for this time reading your Bible in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
Just go and get some serviettes.
Yeah, this one wants to say some
Yes.
similar with mine.
Yes.
Ah.
Yes, that's right.